Do you have a day off routine? I have a usual circuit. It includes things like heading by the library and the grocery store, getting to a yoga class, stopping by to visit my mother. This past Friday, I also looked over 2 bids for some house projects I'm thinking of doing, and I talked to my brother about additional care we might pay for my mother. A typical day off. I also sat down to write my sermon for this Sunday, and I knew I was going to get this little passage about render to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. And I thought, okay, it's stewardship season. I'm going to tell him all about money. Seems perfect, right? So I sat down to do this thinking about money, and I realized I've been thinking about money in some way, shape, or form all day long. I mean, honestly, you got to pull out your credit card or the cash when you go to the grocery store. You pay taxes for things like the library. There are unseen things like the heat that comes on magically in my home that I'm paying for. All kinds of things. It's almost like just eating and breathing costs something. And I realized that part of my brain was compartmentalizing. There's like the everyday kinds of decisions that have to do in the background. There's money there all the time. And then there's the faith part. And it seemed like sometimes they don't talk. In our gospel lesson today, the Pharisees ask a question about faith and money. And the Pharisees in Jesus' day were very faithful people. Their kind of main aim was to make every aspect of life an act of faithfulness to God. That's why they followed all the commandments scrupulously. And so they ask about paying taxes to Rome. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Seems like a good question to ask. I mean, after all, the Jews had to pay this tax because they'd been conquered by a foreign army, and that's what foreign armies did. They levied tax on the people they conquered so they could build roads and build up armies and conquer more peoples. Needless to say, often the subjugated peoples did not feel very good about that tax. And not only that, but for the Jews it was especially odious because on the very coin they had to pay these taxes with, there was a picture of the emperor, and on the coin it said, the emperor was divine. Ah, there's the picture. There's Caesar. So they had more than one reason for hating this tax. And nonetheless, this was the currency they used for their everyday affairs, for paying for goods that they needed. And their own religious tradition supported that God could indeed use foreign rulers for God's glory, as we heard about in our first lesson. So, it was a good question to pose. How should a good Jew use his or her money? Now, this was indeed an excellent question, a genuine question for many, but not for the people who were opposing it to Jesus in this moment. These particular Pharisees and the Herodians, they were kind of the elite class in league with Herod the king, the provincial king, the puppet king. These people wanted to trap Jesus. They were sick and tired of the way he was always pointing his parables at them. And they were thinking about getting rid of him. And so this question was trying to put Jesus between a rock and a hard place. If Jesus said, yes, pay the tax, he would enrage the people who hated it. And if he said, no, don't pay the tax, the Romans would be after him. The Pharisees and the Herodians were hoping that Jesus would take sides, but Jesus succeeded in taking this money question out of partisan politics and putting it into a spiritual context. You see, the Pharisees had their own teaching about the coin that they paid these taxes with. And they said, Caesar's picture is here for one reason, and that is because he can get us to pay him a few coins of taxes. But guess what? The face of God is put on all God's people. And therefore, while we might owe a few coins to Caesar, our whole lives belong to God. So there, Caesar. It's actually kind of a radical concept that our whole lives belong to God. And maybe you've heard it before. Maybe those words have even escaped your lips sometime. But when you really stop to think about it, it's not the way we operate. It's not even the way I operate most of the time. Because honestly, we do have financial obligations we can't avoid. We have things we value, like education and travel, sports or the arts. And we value things like these ministries. And so what we do with our money communicates what we care about. But that is still different than what is being talked about in today's lesson. That our whole life belongs to God. That's not we get to decide what to do with our money so that it matches our values, which is a good way to live. No, it's actually like this money that is entrusted to us is just passing through. We don't actually own anything. It's on loan to us from God. We are stewards or managers of that which belongs to another. We acknowledge it in our offertory prayer, which we'll say in a few minutes. God of power, God of plenty, all things belong to you. It's like all this time we've been thinking about faith and money as if it were a Venn diagram and that they were two circles and we were looking for the way that they should overlap. When actually, faith is like the big circle because we are encompassed in God's love and everything else inside there is part of that life and love of God, including how we choose to use the money entrusted to us and how we choose to use our time and our talents and our relationships. So I wonder, what does it actually look like to have these kinds of everyday decisions, which are important and we care about, as a subset of these overall trusting, loving notions about God? I want to tell you about a person, I think, who I noticed embodied these qualities, and his name was Paul. He's one of my parishioners a few churches back. He grew up in the 1930s and was stricken with polio, and he was always walking with a limp after that time, but it did not stop him. He was so civic-minded and generous. He was a leader as a young Luther leaguer. That was before high school ministry was a thing. He led the church council. He worked on the regional level of Lutherans and even on the all of New England level of Lutherans and was the treasurer for those organizations. He and his wife, Ruth, funded a playground in town and started a college scholarship. And of course, they supported the church. Paul was awarded Volunteer of the Year one year when I was with him. And he really was a steward of everything that he had. And he loved to use it to the benefit of the whole community. Sad to say, the year before I moved from that congregation, Paul passed away. But let me tell you, his legacy of this life lived in service of others, this life of being a manager of all that God had entrusted to him, was no more evident than on the day of his funeral. Because the first 4 rows of the church were full of his family. They were like an army because he had 3 sons, and they had kids, and now they were all young adults. And would you believe that that same idea that their lives were entrusted to them by God to be used in service of others, in generosity of others, was something that they had absorbed. And so they were firefighters and public school teachers and running for city council and the school board. And I thought to myself, there is no better tribute to Paul than this army of God's workers who are sitting out here. Paul and his wife Ruth's generosity was a gift that kept on giving. Now, I have to say that, of course, that family gave very generously to our annual appeal. They were one of the reasons why that small church succeeded. And he did remember this church and his estate planning, and it continues to bless them and keep them viable economically today in a changing environment. But what I'm here to say to you today is less about that and more about the overall picture of what his life was like. Because he understood that his whole life was God and that these financial decisions were a part of that, underneath that aegis, he could honestly make those decisions in a proper context, and he got so much joy out of it. He was a person who always knew that God provided, and he regularly tested that presumption with his generosity, that when he let some go, something more would come his way. And the way that his children held up that legacy, the way they stood together on that day of his funeral, it was clear to me that they found value in the way they'd been taught to live, and they would choose no other way to exist in the world. That family utilized what had been entrusted to them, their time, their talent, and their treasure, as spiritual tools to help them grow and to make the world more like God's vision of what the world ought to be. We have people like that in this church too. You who sit here today are giving of yourselves and are understanding the ways that you have been entrusted with gifts. Things that are on loan to you that you can use in God's service, that you can steward and grow for God's glory. We have been blessed to serve. And it isn't only because it changes us for the better and changes the world for the better. It is also because it enlarges all of our hearts and souls. Give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's. Give to God the things that are God's. We have obligations and responsibilities. It's true, and we should honor them. And yet, Jesus points us to a larger, more joyful reality, that all of our lives are lived within God's loving care for us and this world. Our lives are a gift to be shared. We live encompassed in that circle of God's graceful provision, and we can trust with confidence our lives and our living to God. Amen.